If you came to the first one, if you came to the first one, just a heads up, this is the same talk, with some minor changes. But so if you were there, feel free to leave if you don't want to hear it again, but feel free to stay if you do. Um, this talk was, I guess, born out of wanting to give kind of helpful tools to people when, I guess I'll start with introducing myself, shall I? My name's Jess. I do English social media and communications for Standing Together. Um, and I guess because I have a psychology degree from a long time ago, I think a lot about how people think and how people engage in discourse. And also just from my own experience, sort of running the social media accounts and needing to communicate in a way that tries to, engage the most amount of people, convince the unconvinced, and to make um, the message that we're trying to share, palatable and understandable to a lot of different groups of people. So this session is not like giving you word for word arguments to like use when you're talking to people, um, but it is aimed at helping you engage with that conversation on like a pretty foundational level, in a way that is more successful in creating actual dialogue with people, and being able to communicate. Sorry, just one second. Great. I think that one of the biggest issues, and I'll talk about it throughout the talk, is that in a lot of ways, many of us basically exist in different realities when we're having these conversations. And it's very hard to actually find um, a reality that all of us are kind of like equally in. And so that's kind of the theme of today's conversation. I did kind of just want to understand a little bit more about you guys as a group. Obviously, there are a lot of people, so we're not going to do much conversation here. If you have a question at any point, send it through to the chat. And then hopefully we have enough time to answer questions at the end, and we'll answer as many as we can. I would like, just before we start, that I have a question for everyone, and I want you to react to the question. Basically, I want to know if you have more trouble or a harder time engaging with someone who is like asking questions or saying arguments from like a more pro-Israel side of things, or from a more pro-Palestine side of things. So if your biggest like concern or issue or conversation that you have a hard time in is coming from a pro-Israel side, can you like react with like a emotion? And then I'll ask the same question for the pro-Palestine side, and I'll see. So put the like thumbs up, or if your camera's on, you can wave just so I can see. But if your camera's off, just like do a thumbs up or something. Okay. Keep your thumbs up. Keep your thumbs up. I'll tell you when to put it down. Cool. Okay, now put your emoji away. Like, I don't actually know how to turn it off. Okay, great. Now I want you to raise an emoji or something if the harder thing for you is from the pro-Palestine side of things. Okay. Okay, a lot of people texting saying they have trouble with both. Great, you're in the right place for this chat. And it seems like we have kind of an equal amount. Okay, that's great. You can put the emojis away. Great. So thank you for joining. I tend to go on tangents and like jump from thing to thing. Sorry, it's just like how I am. I hope that that will be engaging for you. So I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay. And great. There are pictures of cats on every slide, so if you like cats, this is for you, I guess. Um, okay. Basically, I wanted to start with something that I think that we don't ask ourselves enough when we're engaging in dialogue with people about a topic like this. And it is like questions that you actually want to be asking yourself about this interaction itself. So before thinking about arguments or anything like that, or what you're actually talking about, you want to think about three main questions. One is like, who are you actually talking to? Number two, what kind of conversation are you in? And number three is, what did they want to get out of the conversation? And what do you want to get out of the conversation? So I'm going to go through each one a bit more in depth. Also, if at any point you want to like take a screenshot or like, I don't know, share a screenshot or a photo of the screen or anything with friends or on social media, you're welcome to, but please be wary of which slides you take photos of, because towards the end, we'll get to some examples of things that people might say. And I would hate it if a photo of any of those examples is taken out of context and someone thinks that that is like the idea that is being pushed in this call. So you'll understand as we go, but just yeah, like really be wary not to kind of share anything that could be really taken wildly out of context. Um okay. So number one is, who are you talking to? Okay. It could be a friend or a partner who cares deeply about you and is concerned that your opinion differs to theirs. Okay. A friend from school or college or an old work colleague that you haven't spoken to in a long time. A colleague or client, like a current colleague or client who is disturbed or uncomfortable with your opinion. A random person on the internet. A family member, a student group on campus. There's all these sorts of different categories of people, and that should ultimately have an impact on how we have this conversation, right? Having a conversation around dinner with your family is very different from having a conversation with a colleague that you haven't seen in a long time who's replied to something you posted on Facebook or X or Instagram. Um, and I think that in some of these cases, there is value in saying, okay, I actually think that I'm not going to engage in this conversation with this person. I think that it's not worth it. And sometimes there is value in engaging with it. What kind of conversation are you in? Okay, so let's say they replied to your social media post and asked a question about what you wrote. They replied to your social media post rudely and started an argument. They asked you a question at a social event. They picked a fight with you at a social event. They sent you a message out of the blue with a question. But they started a private conversation with you about Israel-Palestine while you were catching up, and you know that you're on different sides of the spectrum. So again, here, like once we've asked ourselves, who is this person? We got to understand, like, what conversation are we actually in? Because in many cases, someone that you have a different opinion to might actually be, starting up an argument just to rile you up. And in some cases, they might actually just want to learn more. And those require different ways of engaging. Um, okay. The next question to ask is, what do you or they want to get out of the conversation? Number one, maybe they want to understand you, or you want to understand their perspective, and you or they want to learn from it. Maybe you want to convince each other of your perspective or their perspective. Maybe one of you wants to convince the other that you are right, that you have the correct opinion, or maybe you or that person are just picking a fight for no good reason. Okay, I think we can all probably identify with a moment at which someone said something that upset us, and then we kind of like picked a fight or argued with that person, but we actually didn't have like a real intention for that conversation. It just upset us, and then we argued with it. So again, these are kind of crucial questions to ask once you understand who you're talking to, like who that person is, and what you or they are trying to get out of the conversation. Then you can understand like how to actually move forward. Because often when we engage in really unproductive conversations, it's because we haven't actually asked these questions and we're not understanding like what we actually want to get out of that conversation. So, as I was saying before, I think that a lot of the issue that many of us face is this idea that we all exist in these different realities. That many of us are interacting with people who have the same views as us. A lot of the time, many of us, are interacting with people that maybe have a similar sort of background or a similar lifestyle, and it leads you to kind of be in these bubbles, okay? Um, and I think that something super, super crucial in any of these discussions, and I think that this is probably the most important slide, um, is to try and understand which world this person is actually living in. So for example, how do they understand the use of force? How does this person understand the use of force? Because for a lot of people, I guess you could say people that are maybe arguing more from the pro-Israel side or more from the right, I guess, for lack of a better word, might understand the use of force as something that like only certain bodies have a right to use force. For example, countries have like an inalienable right to use force. And groups that are not countries don't have a right to use force, or people, individuals don't have a right to use force. And so if you're having a conversation around, for example, October 7th or Israel's conduct in Gaza, these conversations are going to go very differently based on whether this person subscribes to the idea that states are able to use force no matter when and how they want, um, or whether that person is actually very against states' use of force and believe in the inalienable right of people or individuals or non-state actors to use force. Right? Those are two completely different conversations that you're having, and trying to understand how someone views something as foundational as use of force can be really, really crucial and helpful in that moment. Number two, how do they understand countries and nations? Is this a person who, like, are you or are you talking to a person who kind of sees countries and states as, very just like legitimate off the bat, that like it's okay to go and create a state and, kill and displace and expel people from that area? And once you have a country in that place, that's legit, and you can do whatever you want as a sovereign nation. Or are you talking to someone, or are you a person that doesn't believe in states or doesn't believe in nation states, doesn't think that it's legitimate to engage in acts of like colonization um, and move forward after a history like that? Um, and again, that's really going to change the conversation because it depends on how someone views the legitimacy of the idea of a state, or even the like whether a state is like good as an idea. How do I see the chat? Can anyone tell me? I don't know why I'm very bad at Zoom after all this time. Let's see if I manage. Here. Okay. I can see the chat. Great. Okay. Oh, sorry. Number three is, how do they understand themselves in relation to the world? So I think this is a very crucial one. I think sometimes we see when people are arguing, I guess from the right or from a more pro-Israel background, in many cases it's people who see themselves as like attached to, I guess, ideas of states or nation states, or feel protected by the idea of a state, feel protected by the idea of some sort of element of the status quo continuing. And when people are arguing from the left or a more pro-Palestinian side, it's often from a place of like not feeling protected by this idea of states or nation states, not feeling like the status quo is something that protects them, actually feeling like the status quo is something that threatens them. I think there are also a lot of people that realistically are in the first world that I described of being protected by states and actually being having that level of privilege, but choosing to identify with people that do not. I think that raises a lot of kind of issues when you're having a conversation with people that kind of take that side as well, because I think it kind of creates this reality that doesn't really exist. Um, but that's essentially really important. What does this person like feel needs to exist in order for them to keep existing in the way that they are, and what threatens them. Which brings us to the next part, which is what needs to be true about the world for them to be accepted in it. And I think that I can say an example, I guess, is this idea of like, I think the concept of like indigeneity has like really, I guess, deepened a lot in like discourse, I guess, on the left in recent years. And there's this idea that like, everyone is kind of like native to a certain place and came from that place. And I think that for people that do really identify with that they're like either themselves are indigenous to a place or their parents are or their grandparents are, that's like a view of the world and it makes them feel very accepted. This idea that like everyone is actually from a certain place, and if everyone just went back to their certain place, there would be like a place for everyone. And I think then there's a lot of people in the world who don't like necessarily fit into that paradigm in the way that like they for generations have not been indigenous to a place in the basic like definition of what it means to be indigenous. And so for them, they like don't feel accepted in that world where everyone is indigenous to a certain place because they don't have those deep roots in a place. And so like the difference in the world in which these people feel accepted in is massive. Again, so from there, then we can talk about what makes that person feel safe and what makes that person feel threatened. And that relates to number 3 as well, in the way of, when someone subscribes to this idea of like feeling protected by this idea of a state, feeling protected by like the status quo, then any threat to that status quo, any threat to like what we know of as how states and countries work or how geopolitics works, any threat to that is going to make them feel threatened. They feel safe if they know that the reality is that states have a monopoly on violence and anyone that's not a state cannot use violence. And that's just the way things are. And people feeling threatened or feeling fearful is going to really drive how open they are to actually engaging in that conversation. And 1 second. Okay. Number 6, I think, is what is their idea of a perfect world? And I think that this is very different depending on whether someone, what perspective someone is coming from, and whether that perspective is coming from a place of like more privilege or a place of feeling of being protected by the status quo or not. Because someone who does feel protected by this status quo or does feel safe in it, their idea of a perfect world is somewhat similar to what exists now, or even where they are just more privileged or more safe. And a person who doesn't have any of these privileges or is, taking the persona of people that don't, their perfect world is vastly different from the world that we live in. And this is again going to change a lot of the way that we look at the world. And then the question to ask after all of these questions is, how does this world differ from the world that you are living in? And is it possible to find a path that connects these two worlds? Okay. We're going to kind of use this theme and go through a few different examples and sort of like unpack these examples based on the things we've spoken about. I think what I'll do is open it up for questions so far, if you have any questions. So feel free to send questions to the chat, and I will also check some of the ones that already exist now. I think that people are saying a lot of like really important things. Like I see here this idea of safety. A lot of people I find most challenging have never felt unsafe. The white or sixth, seventh generation Ashkenazim have inherited wealth. Um, mm, mm, mm. And yeah, a lot of the time that the people who I guess I was talking about, who are usually privileged and protected in the West, talk a lot about what what they think is best for the other, and like not actually using the voice of the other. That being said, I think that there also are really loud voices amongst people who are not protected and privileged in the West, who those people use the other people's voices. Like I think that there it's not that these people have completely made up these ideas about what people want, but often they are, I guess, exploiting those things. Um, I think, okay, so Ben asked a question which was, in some cases, these questions are easily answerable. In others, it requires projecting their feelings or understandings. It depends on the context, of course, but is it worthwhile to ask these things directly? I think a lot of these questions are things that you don't necessarily ask directly, but that you ask questions that enable you to understand these things. I think asking someone about who they think like has a right to use violence, or what they think of, you know, the status quo or existence of states as we know it. What they think is a thing that will bring people safety. I think asking those questions are important if you don't understand, if you don't know with regards to this person that you're talking to. Um, okay, we're gonna move on from that. This cute little quote, and these little caddies, that says people start to heal the moment they feel heard. And I think this is both like a very simple idea and also can be complicated and something we don't necessarily always like engaging with. Because I think for the most part, people get defensive and angry in a conversation when they don't feel like you understand them. Because a lot of people, even if like the things that you think these people are saying are quite like hurtful or damaging even, or like mean or racist, a lot of people don't think that about themselves, right? Like that's not how they perceive what they're saying. They don't think that they are racist and bigoted and whatever, or they don't think that they're, I don't know, anti-Semitic or whatever it is, but they think that they're like in the right for some reason or the other. Or they think that what they are saying is connected to this thing that they think is good for people in many cases. Um, and I think that where possible, trying to show that person um, that they are heard and you see them and you see the things that they want, um, is a really crucial part of any conversation. Um, I have a someone like I'm also a personal trainer as well as my job studying together, and so I'm involved in this whole other realm, which, as I'm sure you can understand, like in Israel and specifically in Tel Aviv, is like a lot of the people that I interact with in that world are not necessarily activists or not necessarily left wing, um, and I have a particular like person in that world who we have like pretty much opposite opinions about everything. Um, and opposite in like quite extreme ways. Like I would say he's one of the most kind of right wing or like extreme right wing people I've spoken to outside of like uncles. Um, and something that I find is like the most, and we've managed to have some really productive conversations, which have actually like gotten us somewhere in understanding. Um, and I find that sometimes what is necessary in these conversations is just to continually reassure this person that we want the same things. And I know that deep down, I don't actually think that we want the same things, because I think that his version of reality is actually very different and in many ways like does actually strip Palestinians of like dignity and rights. But when I say we want the same things, I'm talking about his desire for security and safety. Because if that's what is driving him, this fear and this desire just to be safe, and this feeling that everyone is out to get us and everyone wants to kill us, it's crucial for him to know that anything I am saying or anything we're arguing about is from the same place that I also want security and I also want safety and I do not want him to be unsafe. And kind of ensuring that he feels that way, or at least he hears that like that's the center of the conversation, means that we're able to actually have a conversation. If I wasn't saying to him, I care about your safety and I care about our safety, and of course that's the number one thing I want, that's it. Like we wouldn't be engaging in this conversation at all. And so I think that sometimes it's just really important to ensure that the other person understands that you want them to be heard and you want that you are understanding where they're coming from. I think that can be a really crucial starting point. I'm just checking the chat again because I see you're sending a lot of messages. Okay, you're like replying to each other. Great. Cool. So let's start with a kind of easy example or easier example. And this is, I guess, a question or argument that comes from people on more of the pro-Israel side or more of the right. Okay. So for example, you're having, I mean, this was written before the ceasefire, even though I don't think the ceasefire is really a ceasefire right now. Someone says to you, they started the war. How can you be pro ceasefire? It's a gift to Hamas. You need to unpack where this person is coming from. Okay. Let's think about who this person is. This person is someone who does not view a siege or a blockade as a permanent state of conflict and war. This person views whatever the status quo was on the 6th of October as like a state of peace or not war. Okay. And so they view the situation as nothing was happening, and then October 7th happened. Okay, and that spurred a war. This person would never, ever, ever respond well at all to you bringing up a history of decades of oppression. And they'll see that if you start any sentence by talking about oppression or decades of oppression or a blockade or a siege, they will take what you have said as a justification for the October 7th attacks. Even if you say you don't support killing innocent people, even if you say you think it was horrible and horrific and you'd never support that, they will view you giving context or explaining that what was happening before October 7th was not a state of peace as justification for the attack, because that's what people do when they engage in this sort of question from that perspective. This person also is focused on this idea of like optics and looking strong and winning the war. So they're thinking about war, or they're thinking about what's happening right now as this kind of like more of a game, okay? Which for the most part, a lot of people that are coming from that side of things will say that they're viewing it according to how things work in the Middle East, and you need to stop thinking about things from such a Western perspective. Like that's often like kind of the thing that's thrown back is like, this is how things work in the Middle East. We talk about winning, we talk about being stronger than one another, we talk about this thing, and you need to stop coming from that kind of peace-loving Western perspective. And so when this person is coming from that perspective, there's literally no reason in that moment for you to bring up the humanitarian situation in Gaza as a reason to end the war, because that's completely irrelevant to this person, because this person sees Hamas started a war. They are responsible for everyone that is killed and all the damage that is done because they started it and they didn't need to start it. And so saying things like, yeah, look, like people are really suffering, the destruction is massive, maybe it's just worth, stopping the killing and stopping the suffering. None of these arguments are going to go anywhere with this person. This person also believes in the legitimacy of continued Israeli military operations in Gaza, and probably believes that at some point Hamas will surrender or Israel will have victory. They will have a really hard time understanding why Hamas just doesn't just like release the hostages just like that without a deal. And this person also might be very confused about, the idea that Palestinians or pro-Palestinians can, or just like, I don't know, anyone that cares about the war ending, could call for a ceasefire, at the same time as Hamas not just like surrendering and giving up the hostages. That like dynamic of Hamas not giving up the hostages and surrendering, and people that support the Palestinian cause fighting for a ceasefire, this person's gonna have a really hard time connecting the dots, because they're like, wait, but like if they want a ceasefire, they can just give back the hostages and surrender. So why do they keep saying they want a ceasefire if they're not doing that? That's something that's not going to be able to be really like comprehended in this conversation. And so I think that there's like a few kind of ways to tackle this. You can start by saying, I understand that Hamas started this war by doing the October 7th attack, but how do you suggest that it is resolved? Okay. This person's likely to say, yeah, Hamas surrenders, gives up control, and gives up the hostages. And then kind of like the next logical point is like, okay, but we know that Hamas is unlikely to surrender, and unlikely to give back hostages outside of a deal. So like what are we waiting for? And how much more killing and damage can we justify while waiting for a moment like that, especially if it endangers the hostages too? And this person, might bring up things like, okay, but it's their fault. It's their fault if they're not doing these things, and then Israel keeps attacking. It's their fault if civilians die, and it's their fault if da 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 da, and they don't care about civilians, and they don't care about their own people. And then you can say, okay, I know that. Like I know from what I've seen that Hamas is not particularly concerned about saving lives of people in Gaza currently. That's like fairly obvious and not controversial, at least in my opinion. And then here is when I think it's relevant to say, like, but you, this person you're talking to, like, you're not Hamas, and Hamas doesn't represent you, I assume. And do you care about the lives of people in Gaza? Do you care about stopping the destruction and killing? Because if so, and if you think that maybe Israel should have those standards, then that's something to support, because you can't change the moral decisions that Hamas has made. You can't impart some sort of view of how you think Hamas should treat civilians in Gaza. But you can decide like what you think that the body that you are backing or that you're supporting does. Um, and then I think you could have a discussion about how, yes, it is very clear that Hamas has been difficult in ceasefire negotiations, but so has Israel. And it's unlikely that Hamas will surrender. But if we want, for example, if this person is really concerned about getting the hostages back, if they want to get the hostages back, we've seen right now that the only way to do that actually is through a ceasefire, and a hostage deal. And really, at the end of the day, just like putting this conversation, moving it away from this like game of chess of like this person is strong and this person is weak and this person is right and this person is not right, and bringing it to a place of like, okay, you love Israel, you care about Israel, you support Israel. Let's think about what we want Israel to be and what we want Israel to do, because we already know like the moral, I guess, decision making of Hamas as a group. And we can demand things of Israel if that's like the side that this person is taking. I'm just checking. I actually think that this chat and some of our misunderstandings of each other reflect some of the key points it's making. Maybe not so useful to try to do this by chat. Thanks. Yeah, I think maybe engaging in arguments with each other in the chat is less helpful, but also you guys do your free time, I guess. Um, cool. Also, if you have any questions, please feel free to send. So this is, for example, like a slide that I was talking about, like if you take screenshots or take photos of any of the slides, like just be wary before sharing them because I don't want it to seem like these are just like messages that I'm trying to send out. But this is an example of a question that you might, or an argument you might get from the other side of the political spectrum. The question or the argument is, how can you condemn Hamas? They are freedom fighters and they have the right to resist. What do you expect a people living under siege to do? So this person views violence through the lens of who is doing it, not through the lens of what the violence is. Okay? They don't really care what the violence is or the like moral implications of that violence. They just care about who's doing it and who they view has a right to do it. So they don't view Israel as an occupying power, as a body that has any right to use violence. And they view Hamas or Palestinian fighters in general as a body that always has the right to use violence. And that is the starting point of this conversation. So if you were to bring up, right, like testimonies or stories about things that happened on October 7th, if you were to say, yeah, but there was this music festival where like over 200 or a few hundred people were just like murdered, like in cold blood, that person doesn't care. Like that's not relevant to that conversation in that moment because that person is not concerned with what the violence is. They're concerned with who has a right to use it. And so starting the conversation with that, with the morality of that violence, it's not going to get anywhere. It's not going to get anywhere because they're going to say, well, what's the difference between that and blowing up a building with 100 people in it? Or what's the difference between that and starving a population? They're just going to bring up these things and you can keep talking about it for ages. Okay. Um, so not concerned about what the violence is, concerned about who's using it. Number two is that this person is likely less focused on effective strategy and more focused on ideas of what they believe is theoretically right or just. Okay, they're unwilling to look at how a policy of violence against civilians has not worked in the favor of Palestinians. Um, so we know that also non-violent resistance has not seemed to be fruitful at all for Palestinians, and many Palestinians are arrested or silenced for any other forms of resisting occupation. But we also know, and we have proof, that the use of violence, specifically when it targets civilians, which is something that Hamas has decided to do actively a couple of decades ago, we know that that hasn't worked at all in the favor of Palestinians. And so that person is focused on this idea of what they think is just, or this idea of what they think is maybe correct in some ethical sense of the word, but not focused on what is actually effective. Because you could say, I'll get to the what you could say soon. When a person says, what do you expect what do you expect people living under siege to do? They're making it very clear that they don't assign any agency to oppressed peoples. So if you jump back at them with what could be done, they likely won't buy into it because they don't assign any sort of like autonomy or agency to people that are living under oppression in that moment. What I would say, what I would suggest to do in a conversation like this is to make the conversation around effective strategy and not around morals, because morals and ethics of the use of violence or what violence is used, again, is not going to be particularly helpful in a conversation where a person cares much more about who's doing the violence than what it is. So instead of saying, but don't you think it's horrible and wrong to, murder all these people at a music festival, you could say, do you think it is strategically helpful to do something like this? Like if we look at the past couple of decades of attacks against civilians, specifically aimed at killing civilians, have any of these attacks been, I guess, successful in bringing the Palestinians any more safety and security and equality and peace? Or have they actually enabled or helped the occupation to entrench itself and become stronger? And I don't say that, but I'm not trying to blame the occupation. Like, I'm not trying to blame Palestinians for the occupation, obviously, but I am saying I think there is a question to be asked around, especially the case of Israel-Palestine, um, with regards to strategy, because people here love to quote other moments in history, when violence has been used also against civilians, or even terrorism has been used, in, I guess, liberation struggles. Um, and there's actually a really good quote in 100 Years War of Palestine by Rashid Khaldi, about he speaks about this guy who was like, I don't know, he's some professor or something, I don't remember very well, um, who was like an expert in Algeria. Okay, he was an expert in these sorts of like violent, like an expert in like the use of violence, and he was saying in many cases, yeah, the use of violence, even violence against civilians, is really successful. And this person, who was an expert in the use of violence, said, except maybe with Israel-Palestine. Because with Israel-Palestine, you're dealing with like the Jewish Israeli population only gets more fearful and more defensive the more it is attacked, specifically the more civilians are attacked. And we know that, we see that, it's happening in front of us. It's very unlikely that there's a situation that the majority of the Jewish population says, you know what, the violence isn't worth it, we're just going to leave. Because that's not an accurate understanding of the Israeli psyche in any way. And that if a person who is coming at this argument from this perspective is not willing to grapple with that, and to grapple with like the actual reality of the Israeli psyche and how that might differ from other populations that have like been, I guess, oppressing another people, then it's very hard to actually have a productive conversation about this. But we can look at the past few decades and say, okay, well, clearly attacks against civilians have led to more violence on the part of Israel, more extreme forms of occupation and oppression and subjugation. And perhaps if we can't talk about this idea from an ethical point of like perspective, we can talk about it from a strategic perspective and understand that it's not even strategically beneficial. Okay, Ellen says, I do have a question about this. I know people who are thrilled with the way Israel's response had benefited Hamas and believe it was an excellent strategy because look at the rallying to the pro-Palestinian cause in the West. While I would agree with that, I think that is also coming from a maybe not misunderstanding, probably misunderstanding of the difference between like popularity and power. I think that it definitely has, like October 7th and Israel's response has definitely garnered a lot of support for Palestine and even for Hamas in general. I think it's garnered more support for Hamas around the world than it has necessarily in the land. But whether or not it is actually given Palestine or the Palestinian people more power or more of a like kind of leg to stand on, I think is in question. I think the fact that, you know, there was this huge movement to end the war, the fact that Israel was taken to the ICJ, the fact that all of these things were happening, all of these countries were calling out Israel's actions, you know, pro-Palestinian demonstrations were happening massively all over the world, and still nothing was able to be stopped. And still the war has now moved to the West Bank. And I don't know if you saw images of today of like Jenin just being blown up completely. it's that I think shines a question on how much it matters that October 7th and Israel's response has caused a shift in like public opinion. Um, because at the end of the day, public opinion is not the thing that shapes reality. The thing that shapes reality is power and like will, political will. And we're currently in this like geopolitical situation in which much of the West or the people that back Israel are like threatened by changes to the status quo, and will do everything in their power not to change anything. So you could say, yeah, sure, maybe it was strategic in some way to get popular support behind Palestine or popular support behind Hamas. But whether that popular support is actually going to be able to shift into like a real solution, that can guarantee people freedom and equality and safety, I'm not sure if that can actually be said. Okay. Understand how this wasn't a success. Question for Jess. I get what you're saying about how to talk to people, but how do you manage your emotional reaction? Okay, great. It's a good question. What answer would you give if this person asked you what would give the Palestinians more power? Um, I think, wow, I think that's a really good question. Um, and I think it demands some reckoning with geopolitics and like who has power um in the world. I think that the more that people who support, I think that the more that people who support Palestine or saying they're pro-Palestinian or on the left or whatever it is, um, refuse to engage with like the different forces that are existing in the world, refuse to engage with like the relevance of like the Islamic Republic and proxies and the relevance of these different kind of dynamics between these countries. And they just say like, whoever supports Palestine and whatever, we don't have to criticize these things. We don't have to engage with these things. As long as that is the status quo, I think it's going to be very hard for actually build political power in the camp of people who care a lot about Palestinians or Palestine. Um, I think a refusal to engage with like the way in which the world currently works, a refusal to engage in normalization or things relating to normalization, is a refusal to engage in the power dynamics of the world. Um, and I think that is fine if that person is not interested in engaging with how power works and not interested in engaging with different types of futures that could be created. Um, but I think if that person is serious about engaging with these things, it requires like some sort of criticism around it. It requires some sort of attaching agency to people, attaching agency to Hamas, attaching agency um, to every group involved in this. Okay, someone said, was there a danger of Palestine being forgotten about pre-7th of October? And how did October 7th change that? And a lot of people are saying, yeah, they're saying like this thing of like, yeah, it was a success because it brought it onto the map. I think that probably it will be like viewed by many people as a successful thing that happened to put Palestine back on the map, similar to like how like the kind of social media and media campaigns in 2021 did a similar thing. But I think that there is a difference between that and actually being a success in creating a reality on the ground that is better and safer and more equal for Palestinians. I think that we're looking at a fair few decades of like very, very awful conditions for Palestinians right now. And maybe someone could look at it from the perspective of, okay, but that's part of this and we need to think long term. Yep, maybe that's true. But I think it's also a question of saying like why. I think there are also a lot of Palestinians that would say like they don't want to necessarily be associated with acts like this. or with what happened on October 7th. I think for a lot of people abroad and a lot of people in the West, it's something that is like viewed more positively because it put Palestine on the map. But I think it's more complicated than that. I think it raises a lot more questions. Okay, I'm gonna keep going and then we can come back for questions. But I think I guess the main points that I wanted to cover with a question like this is these questions of, is this person viewing violence as a thing that you can judge based on what the violence is? Or are they viewing violence as just, it's right or wrong depending on who is doing it? And is this person assigning agency to people that live under oppression? And I think that those two questions are crucial because you just need to know kind of what not to argue in that moment, what is not going to work. And what is not going to work is talking about the morality of these acts. And what's not going to work is trying to assign any agency to people living under occupation. And so talking more strictly about strategy, I think, is a much better way to handle a question like this. And this is a sort of argument that could end in more questions than answers. It could end in like okay, so maybe this might not be, like strategically, this might not be working after many decades. And we don't know actually what would work, but I think that is still progress at the end of the day. It's like ending in questions. Okay, another example. Someone says the occupation of the West Bank is necessary for Israel's security. Okay, it's pretty clear that this person is coming from the perspective of being primarily concerned with Israel's security. And what is good for Israel's security is worth doing, and what is bad for Israel's security is not worth doing. This person is not necessarily thinking in the long term. They're just thinking about stopping people from having the ability to attack or kill civilians. Or not even civilians, but kill any Israelis. And in this moment, when someone is saying something like this, it is crucial to ensure that they do not feel threatened in this conversation, and to ensure that anything that you're about to say is because you want the thing that they want, which is Israel's security. You might not be willing to say that it's fine to oppress or control militarily another people to get there, but you need to show that person that you are deeply concerned with Israel's security. Because any conversation with that person about ending the occupation is not going to go down well if they don't think that you're actually concerned with Israel's security. And it's literally the parallel to the conversation before about violent resistance, and this conversation is now about strategy. It's saying, okay, I understand that a big wall and checkpoints makes you feel like there is security or makes you feel safe. But if we look at the past few decades, apart from the physical ability to stop some attacks from happening, has this thing, the occupation, led to security for Israelis? Because first, you could bring up here October 7th and that it was the worst attack, but generally this person's response is going to be that happened because we disengaged from Gaza. Like they're going to argue with that, and they're going to say, well, we never had an October 7th from the West Bank. In fact, but there were the intifadas and whatever, but that person is going to clap back with that. Okay, so bringing up October 7th here is also probably not going to be helpful. But bringing up the idea that Israel is currently like the least secure that it's been in decades, okay, it has attacks from the most amounts of fronts that it's had in decades. And the policy that has been set for all of those decades has been a policy of never-ending occupation, of more settlement building, and of entrenchment of this occupation. And so how has that actually brought security? This person is not thinking about how, decades of occupation, lack of opportunities, lack of economic growth in somewhere like the West Bank breeds more attacks on civilians in Israel, breeds more discontent, breeds more anger and more fear. And so bringing up those things is going to be somewhat challenging. I do think it's worth it, but I also think that you would need to be cautious here because this person, in many cases, not all, but I do think in some cases that this person doesn't really humanize Palestinians in a way that maybe you do or in a way that you think that someone should. Because I think that being able to say um, any of this is like all of this is necessary in order to justify Israel's security, I think hints at like either not knowing what happens in the occupation and what that daily reality looks like for Palestinians, or like believing that it's fine. And I think you can only believe that like it is fine if you have some level of dehumanization. It doesn't have to be like a super high level of dehumanization. Um, but I think that there is some level of that there. Um, and I think if you're, and that person oftentimes might just view Palestinians as a violent people, which is the case from a lot of people that are arguing from that perspective. Is they're like, well, these people inherently want to be violent against Israel, or are inherently anti-Semitic, or will always hate Israel's existence or the existence of Israelis. Um, and so when you bring up a topic like, okay, but this only breeds more violence and this only causes more people to join these kind of like violent campaigns, um, I think it can be really complex for this person. They'll view that as you blaming Israel on everything. And I think that there is some reason also here to ascribe, like to prescribe agency to Palestinians in this moment and to say, yes, people do make decisions. People do make decisions to engage in acts of violence that target civilians. Um, but that is not an inherent worldview of Palestinians. It's not inherent to Palestinians. And these things are also a symptom of occupation. Um, okay, question which is kind of related to the question before this. On bringing worlds together, I get the impression that many or even most Palestinians currently don't believe that October 7th happened in the way that it did. They're getting the message that the worst of it is Israeli propaganda. Can I address this? I fear that the possibility of mutual ground when we can't agree on basic facts. I 100% agree, and I think you could say the same for a lot of Israelis about what's happening in Gaza. And I think it's a really big problem. Angie says, please could you say how long this meeting will last? Not much longer. I have like one more question I want to go through, and then we'll like open up to questions for people that are interested. But very soon we'll end. So yeah, the question that Ruth was asking, I think is really, really, really fair. And I really think it can be said on both sides. And I think that a desire for the other side to understand what happened to people maybe that you're connected to comes with a responsibility to understand the thing that is happening to the people that they're connected with. I think it is a huge, huge, huge thing getting in the way of um, people being able to understand, the fear on both sides, the reason that both sides kind of want revenge. But yeah, I think that's true. And I actually think that that's probably a very important underlying question to many of these conversations is how much the people that you're talking to, the person that you're talking to, actually understands what the reality is on either side. Um, I keep bringing up the Nova Festival massacre because I think it's actually one of the kind of stories from October 7th. That when I feel like I get really distant from like the kind of memory of what happened on October 7th, or I'm, seeing awful scenes coming out of Gaza every day, and I'm feeling like it's making my memory of October 7th smaller and smaller and smaller, I actually go on the Wikipedia page for the Nova Massacre and just read it. And it brings me straight back down to reality, because I understand that like that's like one of the most horrific things I've ever read. Um, and it kind of reminds me of the reality on the ground. And I think that's an experience that I'm having as someone who is like a Jewish Israeli living here who was affected by that. And I still need to remind myself of the gravity of that event. So someone that is not at all connected to Jews or Israelis, someone that has not heard about what happened on October 7th, the distance that they have to understanding that is massive, right? And very similar for someone that is not exposed to media other than Israeli media or certain sections of Western media, that really don't show them what is happening on the ground in Gaza. I think some of the most like harrowing testimonies and stories I've heard have been like from these, these doctors that have gone to work in Gaza and have come back with these like just horrific stories, right? And you hear those stories and you're like, this is the worst thing I've ever heard. And there are people that are not hearing this. There are people that are not understanding this. And so I think, yeah, underlying all of these questions that you need to ask yourself is the question of what is this person's actual version of reality? Again, in many cases, their version of reality is underpinned by whether they view the victims of whatever you're talking about as human beings. Like I think that really underpins so much of it, because if you've gone through a process of dehumanization of Palestinians, anything you see in Gaza or hear about in Gaza, it just doesn't really like affect you in the same way, because you don't really view these people as human beings. Same way with October 7th. If you've demonized or dehumanized Israelis, doesn't really affect you because you look at these Israelis and you don't see them as human beings. And so it just doesn't land in the same way. And so that's why I think those are fundamental questions. Yeah, I think what Jeffrey said is really, really right, that the worst dehumanizing rhetoric on both sides is a perfect mirror image, 100%. I often think and talk about this, about how much both sides are obsessed with saying that the other side is lying. That like the like Hollywood thing that people say, that like, oh, people in Gaza are like making up these scenes, everything's made up. And then people on the other side of the spectrum are saying, well, everything about October 7th was made up or exaggerated. 100%, they're complete mirror images of each other. And I think sometimes bringing up that mirror image is really, really helpful. Showing someone in that moment, because someone who is talking a lot about all these things about October 7th who were made up, saying to this person, did you know that there's actually also rhetoric on like the pro-Israel side about how everything that happens in Gaza is made up? And kind of showing that mirror image to someone, I think, can also be really helpful. I'm going to go through the last example. Sorry, I'm a bit like moving from one thing to the other and back and forth and rambling, but I hope it's okay. I thought this cat was probably the cutest cat photo, actually. Oh no, actually, there's a cuter one coming. Last example, and this is fairly short. Is someone that says something like, Jews have no right to be there, they should just leave. I think this is like a bit more of like a clear-cut example. Or I guess the parallel to this is like Jews have no right to be there and should just leave, or Israel just has no right to exist and should just stop existing. This person is viewing the world through a lens of individualism and guilt culture. This idea that like the thing that we individually do or engage in is either like a moral good or a moral bad in society. And therefore, the existence of Jewish Israelis in Palestine is morally bad, and the way to fix it must be leaving. And that makes things morally good, because it's ultimately like an individual guilt-based way of looking at society. A lot of people, when arguing with a person that says this, will start with, yeah, but Israelis have nowhere to go, especially like Mizrahim, like people who came from Arab countries, they have nowhere to go, and Jews have had a connection to the land for a long time, and blah, 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 blah. don't. Like, don't start with that. Never start with that. Because that's not, I think that that's not like actually answering what this person is trying to say. This person is concerned with this idea that there is something that feels immoral and bad, and they need to fix the immoral and bad thing by making it go away. And what I would probably start with this person is saying, why do you feel like Jews leaving is the solution? Like, what about Jewish Israelis leaving actually helps? And you can talk about how, okay, a very small minority of Jewish Israelis would feel guilty enough to be on the land that they were born on or have a connection to, that they would leave. And if they leave, the majority of Israelis that stay are Israelis that don't feel any sense of guilt towards being there. So if we view it as like this slow process, right? Like let's humor this idea and say, okay, let's have an information campaign to convince all Israelis that they should leave. We'll do heaps of BDS. We'll make people's lives really, really bad. And then slowly people will leave. I think that people are not understanding how fanatical, how strong the like fanatical side of some extremists in Israel are, and not even extremists, but like a lot of people that are willing to die to have a Jewish state, and are primarily concerned with having a Jewish state and are not actually concerned about Taylor Swift coming and playing in Israel, and are not actually concerned about the cost of living, and are not concerned about being arrested if they fly to a country because they served in the army. They're concerned with having a Jewish state. They're concerned with feeling safe and having a Jewish state. And that, I think, is actually a lot of people in Israel. And saying that it's not, I think, is misreading reality. And I think that saying, and I think that when people talk about this, that they're thinking about like Algeria. And I think that their maybe memory, like the way that they view what happened in Algeria is like, I don't know, like one day everyone just like went back to France, and there wasn't like a war that led to 1 million or 1.5 million Algerians being killed. And it wasn't extremely bloody and violent. No one was sent to concentration camps. Like, I think these are people's ideas about things that happened in history, are often just like not necessarily accurate, and also not necessarily accurate to the context. And not understanding, number one, yes, for many people, for many Jewish Israelis, they don't feel like they have anywhere else to go. This is not a situation that, at least in the moment that we're in it, is particularly comparable to Algeria. And I think that with a conversation like this, though, again, you want to come back to understanding that this person is primarily concerned with making the bad thing go away, making the bad feeling that is making them feel guilty and making them feel wrong go away. And I would kind of say, like, okay, beyond the question of why do they feel like this is the solution, saying like, okay, hypothetically, let's say this ends up happening, right? Let's say hypothetically, all Jewish Israelis just decide at some point to get up and go. That is something that's going to take many, many, many decades to happen. It's going to take many, many, many wars to happen. It's going to take a lot of bloodshed to happen. And I think that the conversation could be about, okay, well, what can we do now? Because like sitting around and like sliding into the DMs of Jewish Israelis telling them that they need to leave, like even if in some hypothetical situation that happens, sure, I'll give you that hypothetical situation. What can you do now to actually be productive in ensuring that in any situation of the future for Palestinians, there is like justice and a good life? And I think that question of justice can also be asked here in terms of like, I think a lot of people see the original injustice was coming to the land, therefore the ultimate justice must be leaving it. And I think you can ask questions about that of like, is that justice? Does that lead to justice? Because at the end of the day, in this hypothetical reality that Jewish Israelis leave, there is some level of forced displacement there, because there will always be people that will not want to leave or who cannot leave, or don't have anywhere else to go. So there is this level of forced displacement. And is forced displacement something we think leads to a just future for anyone or not? Like, I think that these are questions to bring up that I think make this question a lot more complicated and complex. And again, I think that the end goal for many conversations doesn't necessarily have to be convincing one or the other, but should be about like kind of trying to get to the same version of reality. I think that's like possibly more productive, or asking more questions, because a lot of people that have these really hardline views on either side are just not asking questions about the things that they think, because they're satisfied with the things that they think. Someone who says, Hamas started this war, now everything that happens is their fault. I don't have to feel any sense of guilt or responsibility over the mass killing of tens of thousands of people, because like they started it. That person then like doesn't feel like they need to investigate their opinions. They don't feel like they need to ask questions about their opinions. And I think that you're not going to convince that person in one conversation to think the way you do, but you might be able to ask enough questions if you can get down to their whatever place they're in reality, and ask them enough questions that can then lead them to question their opinions and to think about maybe what version of reality you're living in, and bring the two of you kind of closer to some sort of shared reality. I think that's very, very helpful. I think that this idea, obviously, also in standing together, like we talk a lot about convincing the unconvinced. But I think that while our role, yes, is to like, you do want to convince people to have the same opinion as you, I think more so we want to find common ground with as many people as we can, because we're probably not all going to agree on the exact same things, but we can find some sort of common understanding of what reality is and how we move forward with it. Just a question from Deb. I'll move to the end. Yeah, this I think is the cutest cat. A question from Deb says, how can you practically have these conversations? It seems like they need to be structured with lots of time and everyone keeping their cool. This is rarely a real life situation. I think I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so that I can go back. Yep. I think that actually there is a lot of benefit in these conversations to just sometimes saying, hang on a sec, can you just give me a second to collect my thoughts? Or just like taking a pause. I wouldn't say that you need to always have, a very structured conversation, but I do think that like really actively just trying as much as you can to stay calm and cool and collected in these conversations is really crucial, because like what are you doing having a crazy argument that's a screaming match with colleagues, right? Like, who is that helping actually? And what are each of you trying to do? Because I think in most cases, in those moments where things are really heated, two people are trying to like protect the thing that makes them feel safe, and they're trying to stop feeling threatened in that moment. And obviously, I think sometimes it sounds like the things that I'm saying are like maybe too rehearsed, or like maybe I don't know, too good to be true, or can't happen in reality. But I do like, this is also coming from personal experience of like a few years ago, I was a person that struggled to engage in these conversations, struggled to talk to people that have different opinions to me. I have many screaming matches with family over the dinner table. And I've now kind of been able to get to the point where I'm actually able to have conversations with people who have different opinions and like get somewhere at the end of a conversation, right? It doesn't mean that you have to convince one another, but to be able to have some sort of shared reality, I think is extremely, extremely, extremely valuable. Okay, feel free to send any questions you might have. We're basically like done the talk, so now it's just questions if you have any, and like send them in the chat. Um, I think what David said is very interesting. Of I hold a broadly pro-Palestinian view, equal rights, justice, etc., but found a trip to Israel was instructive as it challenged me to listen because I knew if I fought back against the common view, then I would just see the conversations come to a quick end. Okay, time in Israel is a privilege of a holiday such experience and not for everyone, but I think I learned from intentionally going to speak to the other side. It may not have changed my view enormously, but it did shift my diet. Totally. And I think in many ways, this is why I think that a lot of us, um, who are like doing sort of activism within Israel or Jewish Palestinian kind of solidarity activism, um, are able to have like quite complex belief systems because we're really interacting with these groups at the same time. Um, I think it's also why, for in many cases, like Palestinian citizens of Israel are like the key to understanding a lot of this because they're the group of Palestinians that live and work with Israelis, which is quite rare. And in many cases can move the needle. In many cases are Israelis' first encounters with like the Palestinian story and Palestinian history. Um, and I think it's that, it's like actually just interacting with these people. I'm just trying to save the chat. Oh, here, great. Um, I had something I wanted to say that was important, but now I have forgotten. So I'm gonna check if there are other questions that were important. Okay, so Hannah says, I get stuck on the Zionism is racism argument and the spectrum of meanings between Zionism and anti-Zionism. I think it's because those things are meant to make you stuck. And those conversations are not meant to do anything other than make you stuck. It's largely why, like, also, I mean, it's not actually why I think standing together in general, like, exists in a realm that just doesn't fit into these definitions of Zionism and anti-Zionism because we are like a group of Jews and Palestinians in Israel fighting together. Like, I think that just doesn't fit in with a lot of these like definitions. Um, and and yeah, I think that's just a conversation that makes people stuck. I think thinking about like why I think that there are, and I say this as like a Jewish person who grew up in like a very Zionist community and no longer like identifies necessarily with these terms one way or the other. But I think that there is meaning to the conversation of unpacking what is Zionism from the perspective of a Palestinian, and why is that important? I think for many Jews who grow up in Zionist communities, people are told that Zionism is Zionism has like a certain description, and you cannot argue with that. Certain definition. You cannot argue with that definition. And I think that there is a lot of value in saying, okay, are Jews the only people that get to define what Zionism is? Are Palestinians able to identify to define what Zionism is? What is the definition of Zionism to a Palestinian who, was from like who was from somewhere within 48 and became a refugee in Gaza? What is their definition of Zionism? What is the definition of Zionism to a diaspora Palestinian? What is the definition of Zionism to a Palestinian that's been in Jaffa for generations? Right. I think that is like an important and meaningful discussion, and that's those are questions that should be asked by a lot of people that have grown up in these environments. But at the same time, I think that there is an obsession with Zionism or anti-Zionism around the world that I'm not sure how productive it actually is in shifting our reality at the end of the day. Beyond just like trying to delve into what these definitions mean and who gets to define them. Nice. Nelson Mandela in his book Long Walks to Freedom stated that the oppressor and the oppressed are both becoming dehumanized. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with either group. It's a system such model that is wrong. That's like one of my favorite books. I recommend everyone read Long Walk to Freedom and 100 Years War in Palestine. I think those are great books. Okay, I think basically we'll end. I kind of feel like we've summarized, like we've kind of gone through most of the question. Maybe Andrew, who is my co on this call, if you saw any other questions that you think are crucial to answer, feel free to send. But I think that we're good for now. So thank you, everyone. It was really lovely to have you join. These are conversations that we offer to like friends of standing together. And it's like kind of exclusive to you guys as supporters. So we're always really happy to have like a more intimate environment to have these sorts of conversations. Feel free to, I guess you can reach out to me on social media or via email. Just email takes a lot longer for me to get back to, but I can put my email here. One sec. This speaker as sending together. I sent my email to the chat. And my Instagram handle is JessBricker, JessBricker. And so you can reach out to me if you have any other questions, or you can email our info email for standing together, and I can see things through there. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed. We'd love any feedback as well. Also, if it's things that you think could be changed or edited for the future. Thank you so much for joining us. Yeah. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.